Hi, my name is Elizabeth Samaro, and today I'm going to be showing you all the disastrous but interesting events of the military coup d'etat in Guinea-Conakry on April 3rd, 1984. But wait, we have to start from the beginning. By 1840, European powers had established small trading posts along the coast. In the middle decades of the 19th century, European explorers had mapped out the areas of East and Central Africa. Even as late as the 1870s, Western European states controlled only 10% of the African continent, with all their territories located near the coast. The most important holdings were Angola and Mozambique, held by the Portuguese,
the Cape Colony, held by the United Kingdom,
and Algeria, held by France. There are two reasons for why the imperialist countries want to take over Africa. One being Africa and its global markets, and the other being for strategic rivalry. Sub-Saharan Africa, one of the last regions of the world largely untouched by imperialistic powers, was also attractive to Europe's ruling powers for economic, political, and social reasons.
During a time when Britain's balance of trade was getting really small, with shrinking and increasingly protectionist, or an economic policy of which restricted imports from other countries through methods such as tariffs on imported goods, import quotas, and a variety of other government regulations in continental markets due to the long depression of 1873 and 1896. Africa offered Britain, Germany, France, and other countries an open market that would garner them a trade surplus, a market that brought more from a colonial power than it sold overall. A surplus capital was often more easier to be invested overseas, where cheap materials, limited competition, and abundant raw materials made a greater premium possible. Another attraction for imperialism arose from the demand for raw materials, especially copper, cotton, rubber, palm oil, cocoa, diamonds, tea, and tin, to which European consumers had grown familiar with, and upon which European industries had grown dependent on. Additionally, Britain wanted southern and eastern coast of Africa for stopover ports on their route to Asia and its empire in India. However, in Africa, excluding the area which became the Union of South Africa in 1910, the amount of capital investments by Europeans was relatively small compared to the other continents. Consequently, the companies involved in the tropical African commerce were relatively small. Apart from Cecil Rhodes, De Beers Mining Company, Rhodes had carved out Rhodesia, which is present-day Zimbabwe, for himself. Leopold II of Belgium later, and with his considerable brutality, enslaved the Congo Free State. And the second cause for the colonization of Africa was strategic rivalry. The rivalry between Britain, France, Germany, and other Western European powers accounts for a large part of the colonization. While tropical Africa was not a large zone of investments, other overseas regions were. The vast interior between Egypt and its gold and diamond-rich southern Africa was strategic value in securing the flow of the overseas trade. Britain was under political pressure to secure markets against the upcoming rivals in China, its eastern colonies, most notably India, Malaya, Australia, and New Zealand. So, it was crucial to secure the key waterway between East and West, the Suez Canal. However, the theory that Britain sought to annex East Africa during the 1800s onward added geostrategic concerns connected to Egypt, especially the Suez Canal. The scramble of African territory also reflected concerns of the beginning of the military and naval bases, with strategic purposes and exercise of power. The growing navies and new ships driven by steam power required coaling stations and ports for maintenance. Defense bases were also needed for protection of sea routes and communication lines, particularly of expensive and vital international waterways such as the Suez Canal. Colonies were also seen as an asset in the balance of power negotiations, useful as items of exchange at times of international bargaining. Colonies with large native populations were also a source of military power. Britain and France used large numbers of British, Indian, and North African soldiers respectively in many of their colonial wars. In the age of nationalism, where pressure for a nation to acquire an empire as a status symbol, the idea of greatness became linked with the sense of duty underlining many nation strategies. There were several crises prior to World War I, but a very important one was the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. The occupation of Egypt and the acquiescence of Congo were the first major moves in what became the perpetual scramble of African territory. In In 1884, Otto von Bismarck convinced the 1884 and 1885 Berlin Conference to discuss the African problem. The diplomats put on humanitarian facade about condemning the slave trade, prohibiting sales of alcoholic beverages and firearms in certain regions, by exposing concerns of missionary activities. More importantly, the diplomats in Berlin laid down rules of competition by which the great powers were to be guided in seeking colonies. They also agreed that the area along the Congo River was to be administered by Leopold II of Belgium as a neutral area, known as the Congo Free State, in which trade and navigation were to be free. No nation was to take state claims in Africa without notifying other powers of its intentions. No territory could be formally claimed prior to being effectively occupied. However, the competitors ignored the rules when convinced on several occasions. After all, this is what the United Kingdom had. This is what Belgium had. This is what Germany had. This is what Italy had. This is what Portugal had. This is what Spain had. And finally, this is what France had. Guinea, a very tiny but important country along the coast of Africa. In 1958, the French Fourth Republic collapsed due to political instability and its failures in dealing with its colonies, especially in Indochina and Algeria. The founding of the Fifth Republic was supported by the French people, while French President Charles de Gaulle made it clear on August 8, 1958, that French colonies were given a stark choice between freedom in a new French community or immediate independence for the referendum to be held on 28th of September 1958. The other colonies chose the first option, but Guinea, under the leadership of Ahmed Sékou Touré, whose Democratic Party won the electoral elections, voted for independence. The French withdrew quickly on the 2nd of October 1958, and Guinea proclaimed itself an independent country, with Sékou Touré as their president. After France withdrew all the economic support it was giving, Guinea quickly aligned itself with the Soviet Union and adopted socialist policies. This alliance was short-lived, however, as Guinea moved towards a Chinese model of socialism. Despite this, however, the country continued to receive aid and investments from capitalist countries such as the United States. He freed Guinea from the colonization of France. 26 years later, President Sékou Touré died on March 26, 1984, after a heart operation in the United States. The citizens of Guinea were all emotionally affected by his death, including my parents, Angeline Bonamu and Ibrahima Sumaro, who were teenagers at this time, but were both greatly affected. But my father's family was affected a little bit more than my mom.
It has a huge impact on myself and the whole family because it was a surprise. Nobody was expecting his death.
President Sékou Touré was replaced by the Prime Minister Louis Lansana Bialouki, who was to serve as an intermediate president between the pending elections. Hours before the meeting, on April 3, 1984, Colonel Lansana Conte and Dira Touré seized power in a bloodless coup. Conte assumed the role of president, with Touré serving as prime minister. Did the takeover affect you and your family?
Personally, no. It didn't affect me at all. I was still in high school, so I had no clue. Affecting my family, not any one of my family was affected.
Conte immediately denounced the previous regime record on the human rights, released 250 political prisoners, and encouraged approximately 200,000 more to return from exile. He also made a decision to turn away from socialism. This did little to stop poverty, and the country showed no immediate signs of moving towards democracy. Eventually, a power struggle developed between Conte and the fellow members of the CMR, Dira Touré, who bravely served as prime minister in April and December of 1984, with the latter being executed in the aftermath of the failed coup attempt in July 1985. Conte took advantage of the coup attempt to execute several members of Ahmed Sékou Touré's close associates, including his half-brother Ismail Touré, former chief prosecutor at Camp Boria, Manmi Kate, Seke Touré, former commander of Camp Bore, Moussa Dakadi, and Abdul Touré, former Minister of the Foreign Affairs. Conte remained in power till his death in on December 22nd, 2000, which almost immediately followed up by another coup d'etat led by Captain Musa Dadis Camara.